Our belief is that most marketing companies are able to build some pipes infrastructure that allows you to like serve up ads and measure them and like do SEO stuff, right? Like they're real good at doing like the robotic algorithmic things that allow you to kind of capture demand. But when you want to generate demand or when you want to fill those pipes, you need some kind of like efficient way of creating content. And on top of that, you also want to be building relationships, right? So like our idea that the best way to create content is not just a asynchronous podcast, but it's this kind of version of like, I get to meet a really compelling person that could also refer me some business, and or I'm happy to be guilty by association with you because you're so smart, while I'm also building a relationship with 10 people that just showed up in the chat here and getting to know what they're about and getting some of that feedback. That as the center point, and how you position those things and how you execute it so that people start showing up and then repurposing and distributing is the product that we sell. And we find that our ideal client is normally a company that really cares about culture, right? Like if you're going to shine a light on people that know you and create a community and let people interact, it's always good to not be a jerk, right? So it's people that care about culture and treat people really, really well. And we also find that they're probably in the 10 to $100 million kind of like revenue range. And we find that if they have given a stab at trying to produce content on their own and it hasn't really worked out for them, they're more likely to then be like, oh, okay, you guys actually have a formula for this thing. We are willing to kind of like ride this thing out and follow this path because it is much more proven. And they've also hit before on another marketing channel, right? Like they're used to winning on marketing. It's just like no longer working as much, right? So that's kind of how if I were to target by persona, that's how I would target, right? How would you recommend I think about this?
Yeah. And you already have a lot of this structured understanding in your head. Like, okay, the companies that are most likely to buy, right? It's just that you go to Zoom Info and you can't just say, I'm looking for companies that care about relationships and community and social selling. Like, can you give me that list? It's like Zoom Info doesn't do that, right? So let me reiterate some of the things that you just talked about and then tell you data sources that you might use to infer this, right?
Awesome.
So let's talk about who has done the podcast in the past, right? What you're talking about, a pain, right? Someone that has tried to produce shows on their own and they're like, boy, this sucked, right? So one way that you could look at that is just look at all the orphaned B2B podcasts. What are the companies, and associate them with companies and say, okay, great. Let's look at iTunes data for the last 5 years. Let's search for keywords like B2B, et cetera. So you could do this in Google. And then you can look at last published date older than 2020. Right. So I'm looking at pull me all the podcasts here that include these types of keywords. So, they're going after your types of audiences and they haven't published, a podcast. So that's one way that you could look at this. You could also do the inverse too and say, how do we identify people that understand social selling or who understand the value being on a podcast? So you could look at which titles of mine have been on more than one podcast. So there's data out there I can send you some links to that will actually track podcast guests. So you can say, all right, give me the people that have been guests on a lot of shows and they understand the value of being a guest. And maybe they're going to be more amenable to starting their own podcast. You can look at who is attempting to get other channels, which we talked about earlier, right? Who is expanding into other marketing channels. And one way that you might do that is look at who mentions social selling, right? They're going to talk about these types of plays that aren't buy my stuff, buy my stuff, buy my stuff. They're going to talk about more of these sort of community. If you talk about things like who has a culture, well, that's a particular, let's actually unpack that. One thing that you're going to need to do if you want to scale some of this outbound is that you're going to need to be able to give that to an engineer and outsourcer and define what culture is, right? So this is where you have context. You know what culture means, but you need to now define that for someone that can go score a company based on that. So for example, does that mean paternity and maternity leave? Is that culture? Does culture mean a learning budget? We see that a lot of job descriptions. You have a learning budget. Does it mean that you have a culture page, right, where you talk about your culture and your job descriptions? And when you sort of dive in a little bit deeper, what does that culture look like? Is it a culture of learning? Is it a culture of testing? Is it what does that mean? And so when you start to combine these types of things, you'll start to see domains bubble up here where maybe they already have a B2B community. They care about relationships. They're talking about social selling. Their leaders have been on podcasts. They are actively spending money on other paid channels. So you start to get a clearer picture about, is a domain an A domain for you, a B domain, or a C domain? And the next thing that you're going to have to do is test to try to find that moment. And how can you identify public signals that identify that a company is like really ready for what you do today and now?
Got it. Smart. Okay. All right. And then you mentioned something else that is, in order to scale this motion, you said I have to get an engineer that can score stuff. Do you have like a recommended way of building out that kind of like skill set in house, or hiring for somebody, or what that looks like?
Yeah, well, so there's two ways that the first way that you should think about doing this is just an outsourcer. I mean, you don't need to hire an engineer usually to get started, and probably a clever way to use Google. So if your audience goes to clay.com/Jordan, you'll get access to one of the tools that I like to do that will allow you to Google search individual domains. So you can say in a spreadsheet format. So you can say, I want to just search HubSpot.com/integrations. So does HubSpot have a integrations page? And you know, maybe those are companies that you work well with, folks that have integrations. Or you talk about culture, right? Like, I want to look at HubSpot.com/careers, and do they talk about paternity leave, or do they talk about a learning budget, right? These keywords. You have to sort of figure out what are the first bets you want to take by paying, and then go look at them manually. And then you can have an outsourcer do some of that. And some of it, even with like that Clay tool, you can run programmatic Google searches and start to identify these folks. But you need to come up with theories first and then go test them. Then you can buy data to scale it, or remove your context and hire an outsourcer to help you do this in larger chunks.
Got it.
What mindset shifts, like what do I have to think differently about, or what do I kind of need to change my beliefs about to kind of really make this work? Because like inbound marketing, like you can do it, but if you kind of have certain mindsets in place, like it just doesn't work long term. So do you see any mindset shifts needed, or is it really just purely tactical?
Yeah, well, so good question here. And I think one of the mindset shifts is you need to think about inversion thinking. So the way that a lot of folks will think about targeting or messaging is, if I can just say the right thing to Pablo, even though he doesn't have a stomach ache, I can sell him Pepto-Bismol. And it's like, no, there is nothing that I can say to Pablo to get him to buy Pepto-Bismol if he doesn't have a stomach ache. But can I sell a knockoff version that I happen to have that's like not the great version if I catch him when he has a stomach ache? You're damn right I can. And so you need to think about, how do you identify, and Google is a great resource. Like, Google Advanced Search is one of the greatest tools that no one ever leverages. And I don't know why. So like, how can I identify the companies that are at the right inflection point for my product? And I have an acronym here that I'm just deploying, so it might be memorable, might fall by the wayside, but it's CAT. And so it's like, you need to think about, how do you identify the companies that you need to like not focus on? So inclusion, exclusion criteria. ABM is really important. So they need to start seeing you everywhere. Title, how do you know for sure that you are targeting the right titles? Your company is going to tell you it's VPs of marketing every day, but the VPs of marketing may not be responsible. And you can just search, again, like Google Jobs for this, right? To understand who's responsible for your metrics. The next CAT is channel. So don't go after engineers in email. It's like not worth it. The engineers hate email. Like, send them a GitHub request or something. GitHub. I say that wrong. I say it wrong. It's GitHub. GitHub. I do it every time. Approach. So these are the two things. So once you get the first CAT and the first C done, then you have a good understanding about all the things that you should and shouldn't focus on. The AT here is approach and timing. So what's the approach to get someone to respond to you? And that's not, hi, Jordan, I'm Jordan, I know everything, fucking respond to me, right? And your approach to me is like, hey, Jordan, do you want to promote yourself? Fuck yeah, I want to promote myself. I love talking about me. You know, it's like, it doesn't matter that you're like, hey, I've got 3 people to watch. I'm like, I don't care. I talk about me all day long. So like, that was a good approach, right? And that's probably going to be number 2. And then timing, like, how do you identify the right time? And this is, you know, if you swing too early, you strike. You swing too late, you strike. Sometimes you might hit a single, sometimes you might hit a double, but That's what you need to experiment with, because it doesn't matter. Like, I was looking at G2, for example, and I did a reverse image search to try to identify someone that commented on a competitor and said, this thing sucks, I hate it for these 15 reasons. And it's like, that might be a great time to reach out. But then they said, fortunately, we've switched to another solution provider. So it actually doesn't matter. In this case, they hated a customer success software. And they're like, I hate it. It's the worst ever. It doesn't matter what message I send to that person. They're locked in for another year. So you really need to think about how can you reduce the number of variables that you're testing and really feel confident, right company, you're hitting them in multiple channels, you know the title, you know the channels, and then as a sales rep, or if you're building sales systems, the thing you want to get right is what's the right approach and how do I test timing to make sure I can get folks at the right time.
Wow. I got way more than I asked for there. Thank you. Sure. I like that.
Yeah.
Cat. That's great.
Yeah, cat. I'm a dog person, so it's like kind of unfortunate that acronym came out the way it was. But yeah, I got it.
Sticking with me. At least.
Yeah, exactly. Great.
Well,
Jordan Ogren, since we have you here on stage, man, and you've clearly followed Jordan Crawford around at least once before, what is it about this message that, like, what do you do? Give us some context, right? Like, what do you do, and why does his message resonate so much, so that maybe folks that are trying to like contextualize it to what they're doing, give us the pain that struck out to you in Jordan's message.
Well, first, I'm a marketer, so I fascinate over sales, how salespeople think. Obviously, there's so much overlap, and I'm at a kind of a startup, so we're trying to market our SaaS product, and I think that's the main issue, is who is the right person or who's going to buy it. And when you don't have as much data, you can't really do tons of these things. But I just think it's very fascinating of this different look at who do we target. It's not personas, which is a marketing thing that has generated and has created, I think, terrible things, but focusing on the pain that your solution solves. And then if your solution doesn't solve pain, you have a bigger problem than like creating 15 personas out of HubSpot's free tool. So it's kind of where I've fascinated on Jordan.
Can you talk about what your company does? Like, give us the one liner, and then I'll give you some examples of the way that you might think about this. I mean, you're a marketer. Do some sales. Come on, let's do some sales. Let's hear about it.
We did. Yeah, Jordan did this on my podcast as well. He made me do the real role play. So here we go. So my Talent Planner is the software that we sell, and it's essentially a tool that helps leaders kind of do talent planning, which is this new category we're creating, which is creating a talent plan. So it's a plan for your talent, but it's essentially attached to your vision, your strategy. So we want to be here in 3 years. We need this group of people, or we need to remove these people from the bus, put these ones on. And it's just a tool that allows you to do your strategic vision, your strategy, and your talent plan. So obviously the leader is that person, but it goes much deeper than just the leader title per se. But do you need any more, Jordan? Or
yeah, well, when do people need a talent plan? When are they like, oh my gosh, we have hired too much, or it's like, oh my, like this is terrible. If we don't know what to hire and when, we're going to be in big trouble.
I think one is if you obviously have like a decent strategy, because you've got over like that hurdle of like, hey, we're kicking ass with the strategy. It's just we don't have the right players, so we're having to hire leadership team, and that's obviously like large costs and large time. Or yeah, I think it's obviously like the pain is that you have to make a hire, or you're developing somebody internally rather than having like that already made up a succession plan for them.
Yeah, well, so let's like just talk about some ideas here that might help you quantify this. And by the way, this is not a thing for sales or marketing. It's really a thing for any growth team. And so like, I want to break that shift. Like, this is only for sales teams, because this type of targeting, if you do it right, the message comes for free. So you can actually talk about their problem. And if you talk about their problem, we found those ads convert 5 to 10x better than sort of traditional ads, even if you're targeting the same company, right? Because you're talking about a thing, they're like, oh yes, that is me. And so, for example, in your case, I might look at how do you identify C-suite titles that have churned very frequently. So like if a company over the last like 6 months has churned a lot of their C-suite, that probably there's some challenges in talent planning. You might look at fluctuations in like LinkedIn Sales Nav will show you ads and gains of people. So who has the wildest fluctuation in both directions? So not just growth, but also layoffs, right? So it's like, that they're having some challenges here. The other way that you might sort of have an understanding about which companies are lacking in a talent plan is like, what is their ratio of employees to people in HR? right? Do they have 1,000 people and then one person in HR? So that person's like drastically understaffed. They can't develop a talent plan. My guess is that fast-growing organizations either cut one of two ways. Either they're just like growing faster than they can control and they're hiring people sort of willy-nilly, or they've already developed a great talent plan because they know they're hiring. So that's something that you may have to sort of compete with, is like, and one of the things that you might look is like, what do their current job postings look like versus their historical growth? So if you see an organization that hasn't really grown at all, and then they are hiring, they have a 30% increase in listings of their jobs. Now it's like, wow, you can even ping that off against the fact if they have any jobs that mention a talent plan or mention like the types of roles. So now you're like, wow, Jordan, you haven't really grown in the last 6 months. It looks like you're about to 5x your staff. And I noticed that you aren't thinking about, in your job descriptions, you haven't mentioned anyone creating a talent plan. Like, it seems like maybe it's time.
Wow. No, that's really good. I'm over here just taking notes, getting a free consulting session. I love it.
Free consulting. Yeah, as long if there's more people on, if it's a Zoom, it's free. But if we do it one-on-one, then it's like,
it's gonna cost. Oh,
yeah, it's gonna cost.
I'm learning a lot myself. Jordan, when you say you can peg a company to how much it's grown, how are you figuring out growth numbers, or how would you figure that out?
Well, I mean, there's a handful of proxies for this. So Harmonic.ai has data on historical employee growth. Apollo will give you growth by department, I think. So you can filter, say, just give me everyone that has increased or decreased in the people department. So maybe you look at people that have laid off in the people or culture department. So now that they're trying to do more with less. Traffic is another good way here, depending on the vertical, right? You might look at SimilarWeb, has really great traffic data. There's a company called dataforseo.com. It's like you can tell it's the cheap version of SimilarWeb. So just by the name, but it's really, really cheap data that I think I don't know how they're getting it, but they'll have traffic data too. And so you might sort of combine these to say, well, my data, like I have jobs data. So it's like, I can tell you who's hiring. Harmonic can tell you what their historical growth has looked like. Apollo can tell you by department. And then you can look at traffic data. So you can kind of combine these things and say, wow, they're really and you might even look at an increase in sales and marketing specifically to know that they're about to invest a lot of money in sales and marketing on top of the other growth metrics that we talked about.
Super interesting. First of all, you've created a SaaS tool that does this for Series A, Series B companies that finds this like in a scalable fashion, right? That's what Blueprint is?
Yeah, we actually are scraping job descriptions to identify these pains. So we're looking at the entire market, monitoring for their jobs, looking how long the job is open for, saving the text so we can help query the text for those key moments of pain. So things that are in people's job descriptions, which you might not sort of realize, is people say, you'll be the first SDR leader. So people that are hiring their first SDR leader are going to have challenges that other folks don't. You'll know, are they using Salesforce on the back end? You'll know what other types of technologies they're using. You'll know what departments work together, right? You'll have an understanding, are they opening an office in APAC? Are they opening up a sales motion in APAC? How do they have a RevOps team, for example? And so you can sort of start to do pattern matching against when you see existing customers usually use us when they have this problem. How do we find those folks at that exact stage in the market? And so we'll help you kind of bucket those keywords to say, wow, these are the accounts that seem to be struggling with these types of problems. And then you can take that research directly to them in a message across channels.
Super smart. So then because your brain works like this, you've kind of figured out the most scalable way to scrape a readily available data source, which is job postings, right? That are a clear pain thing, right? When somebody is hiring for somebody, it's because they're lacking something in their company. And then on top of that, it has this other rich data because they're forced to be descriptive on why it's happening and what your role is going to be and your day-to-day and whatnot, right? And that now becomes a solution for SaaS companies that make those jobs easier for whomever is going to handle it, right? Or maybe makes a supervisor able to do the role of what 5 people were going to do. Now it's maybe just 1 person plus this software kind of thing. And you can target that way.
Yeah. And I want to say something about that. This is not about replacing that person. It's not about saying, hire my software instead of this person. That's not a way that sort of people behave. But like, let's just talk about different ways that you might sort of use this data at scale, right? So one of the things that we're testing out is actually matching a job description to a person. So I can say, hey, Pablo, I think I bookmarked what used to be your job description when it was open, and I see that you just started this company. It seems like one of the things that you're going to be responsible for doing is creating case studies. I noticed you don't have a case study site. How are you going to create a bunch of case studies without the sort of support of, a video team or whatever, if you're doing video case studies? Another way that you might kind of think about this data is like, I have a friend that sells, the phone numbers, right, for cold calling. Well, how do you know which companies cold call? Well, they talk about it in their job descriptions, right? They'll talk about in sales, you'll have to cold call. So if you're targeting organizations that cold call, now you know. I had another guy that reached out that said, hey, Jordan, we help TikTok folks that are doing TikTok ads. I'm like, I'm not doing TikTok ads. Like, you just wasted your effort on me. So you might want to build a list of companies that are actively not only just using TikTok, but who's exploring TikTok or who's exploring other channels, right? So maybe they're hiring someone that says, try new channels or explore new channels or try other ad platforms, right? And now you know that these people are actively thinking about, wow, my pipeline is really drying up and I need other ways to find who to target.
How do you outsource the idea of finding and writing and securing grants for certain types of nonprofits that are at a certain operational capacity? And she's also moving the world into this idea that nonprofit fundraising, philanthropic fundraising, creating impact, the whole system is inefficient, right? Like, so she's looking to disrupt that. And we got some ideas of how we're going to go from that from to to in the narrative. But her question as she wrote it is, how would you reverse engineer the outbound message for nonprofit execs looking to build upon the success of their grant program and that it is a specialty role? So know that the grant building program, somebody writing grants, is a specialty role. Is there a way to target that pain in some way? And I added the extra context because I figured that it could inform even more of a strategic.
Yeah. So again, this is where inversion thinking might help. If you have such a good understanding of the grants, I actually would lead with the grants that they could apply for. So what are the grants and how much money are they and how competitive are they? So I often talk about the goal of a good cold email is what are they going to forward independent if they reply to you? So like, what's an email so good that I'm like, wow, this is amazing. And so I would say that if you have such a good I would do the reverse and understand how can you get to know what are the biggest grants, the biggest opportunities that not many people are applying to, or that require like specialty information to apply to, or the rejection rate is high, and actually say, hey, Larry, your business does this. Did you know that there's $2.6 million in grants? 1.2 of that is really, really hard to get. Most people get rejected for 5 very simple things. I noticed that you don't have a grant manager, or I noticed that your grant manager focuses on this area, which you could reverse engineer based on their historical job posting, right? So you could find how they talked about that grant position. But I would actually figure out not who to talk to and how to convince them. I would say, what do you know about grants and which specific grants? And then go find organizations that should apply for those grants and talk specifically about the opportunity and why they shouldn't do it themselves.
Genius. That is, make your cold email outreach so good that it's forwardable. Like that idea of add so much value on the front end that the thing that you're leading with is something that they're going to want to share with people, whether or not they hire you or not, I think is absolute genius, man.